Um, yeah, I'm really happy to introduce our speaker today for this weekly seminar. This is our weekly seminar for the Center of Excellence in Biodiversity and Natural Resource Management at University of Rwanda. And we have a variety of different talks each week, which are from researchers in Rwanda, from the university, from NGOs, from private sector, anywhere. We also have many international speakers at all different levels of where they are in their research career, and we welcome people who have just an idea and want to talk about a research or project idea, all the way up to I'm talking about a recently published work. So you're welcome to give a talk if any of you have something you'd like to talk about. And today I'm just especially excited to welcome Kayla Cranston here. Kayla was one of my PhD students at Antioch University, New England, in the Environmental Studies department when I was there. In environmental studies, she actually introduced me to the field of conservation psychology, and she worked with a very close friend and colleague of ours, Carol Saunders, who's a pioneer in the field of conservation psychology. And Kayla Cranston has really carried on the torch of this relatively new field. And for me and for us here in Rwanda, I think our big interest is in how we do these capacity building projects for biodiversity conservation and ensure that they are sustainable or durable, that they last beyond the life of a project. So that's something that Kayla's been working on. So I'm really excited to introduce her here, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Kayla, and people, you're welcome to, all the participants here, you're welcome to put comments in the chat or raise your hand and ask at the end of the so you can interact directly with Kayla as well. So thank you, Kayla, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, Beth. And the reality is that you've just said a lot of the things that I was going to say in my presentation. Or in my intro here. So I'll try to be succinct, just mentioning a few things that will be important for the presentation. But first of all, let me just say hello. I am so glad to be here. And as Beth mentioned, I was one of her students. And once I graduated, went on to do a postdoctoral scholarship position at Oregon State University, which is in the United States, in Corvallis, Oregon, and worked with fishermen there on burnout, which is the opposite of what we're going to talk about today, which is that longer term behavior, all the while really applying the things that Beth and I worked on in my dissertation. And I have a lot to thank Beth for. I have a lot to thank the Regional Network of Educators in the Albertine Rift for. If you're familiar, that's kind of the folks that I worked with. And I'm really excited to get to know you all in the Q&A. What's important to our presentation today to know about me is that after my postdoc, I went on to work for a few years at a zoological institution called the St. Louis Zoo in Missouri, which is also in the US. And the last time I presented all of this, I had just gotten, to my postdoc and had been working a lot with international populations. And so we will use some examples of that today. However, a lot of the examples, as I ground what I'm going to talk about today in reality, will be with more urban populations in the United States at the different zoos that I'm currently working with. And so, but before we do all of that, we can just switch to the next slides. Fantastic. Okay, so right. So thank you all for being here. As you probably have gathered, I do work with international organizations to build their own capacity in this area. And a lot of my work is based on the research that I've conducted in North America and in East Africa on the most effective training methods to accomplish these goals. So on top of that, I also do coaching. I rejoined the Antioch team as the head of the Conservation Psychology Institute, and here we are. So if you are interested in applying anything of what we talk about today, please do get a hold of me. I'm going to discuss with you today what psychological science can actually tell us about how we as trainers can motivate our participants to apply the skills that they have learned from us long after they've left our classrooms or our trainings, educational events, or even how folks can continue a behavior that we have started with them through capacity building interventions. And that's basically what we're doing. So let's see. So this slide that you have in front of you is basically telling you what the title of my dissertation was all about. And everything we'll talk about today is actually based on the findings of my dissertation research on this topic, and which I think Beth mentioned I completed at Antioch University. And the trainers that I was working with during that research, which I've represented on this slide, include the Human-Wildlife Conflict Collaboration, which I think nowadays has a different name, but whatever. They are, I believe, CPEACE now. So Conservation Peace, I think is what they're called. And I also, of course, worked with the regional network of conservation educators in the Albertine Rift. Conservation educators and researchers, I think, is what I have there, yes, in the Albertine Rift. And I also worked with the Tropical Biology Association. So these are the organizations that I worked with. They have a lot of things in common, but one of which was that they created training programs to build the capacity of a diverse set of conservation professionals to apply the new skills, right? So anything from GIS to program management to even social science, to really apply those new skills directly. And the idea here is that these are skills that, you know, these folks always wanted to apply perhaps to their work, but as conservation professionals, they had not been taught in how to do this. So their foundational education wasn't allowing for it. And so that's what these trainings were there to supplement. So that's where the organizations played a role. And the idea was that if the trainers at HWCC or TBA or RNCEAR could build the capacity of the professionals that they trained, then the expert trainers or the other experts that were training them would not have to be in the room, right? Or be called every time a certain skill set was needed, right? That's the basis of capacity building, you all know, in the future. And so this is basic concept. It's often called capacity building in the field of conservation. So as I was studying this topic in this area, I found that what a lot of trainers started to notice in their capacity building trainings, and maybe you have as well, is that while many professionals seemed super excited about applying these new concepts during and directly after the training, it was largely unpredictable whether or not those participants who would continue to apply those skills over time to their environmental work, right? So there was the problem. The trainers would connect, for instance, with their alumni months or even years after the training, and find out that some had and some had not continued to apply their skills over time. And they really had only collected anecdotal stories about this that might have explained why some did and why some didn't. And so that's what got me really excited about this idea, because my research focuses on using the science of psychology to quantifiably determine with a psychometric instrument that I created and we'll talk about today. But its aim is to really help us identify what kept the training participants motivated over time to apply their skills after training in general. So today we're going to talk about the big 5 psychological dimensions, and in this case we call them the 5 factors of sustained capacity for biodiversity conservation. That's the plan. And I have found that these big 5, and I'm not sure, let's see, am I on the right slide to be talking about this? Yes, I am, so don't move it. But so, right, I have found that these big 5 that we're going to talk about really do predict about 34% of the variance in whether or not a professional continues to apply a newly learned skill after a training. So, okay, now we can move on to the next slide. So I think before we dive into all of that important content, I want us to really think about our own personal experience with this. So we want to apply this to our own personal experience. So that's where we'll start. So I'm going to ask you to do a little exercise with me here. So I want you to think about a time in your life, either as a professional or not, where you were part of a training that went really well, and you can click the first picture if you can. Really well, where everybody was very excited and continued to do the thing over time that they were trained to do. And this might be easy to think about or might not. What might be easier to think about actually is a time in which you were a part of a training that went really badly, or whether or not you were the trainer or an attendee. Those types of trainings are usually the most memorable. So can you remember, the idea here is that, oh, and Beth, you can do the next picture. Thank you. So it might have looked something like this, right? And the idea here is that we want you to think about why the experience that you are thinking about right now went so well or did not go so well. And so I'm actually going to give you I'm going to pause for a few moments and have you think about either an experience where you went really well or an experience where it went not so well. Okay, now hopefully you all have at least one example in your mind. And the whole idea here is that I'm asking you to remember something about that experience that went really well, and then also about a training experience that didn't go so well. And the idea is that who's teaching, what the topic was, think about those things in that example, but also in the good example. And the whole idea here is that as we move forward through our topic today, what I would like you to consider is those exact experiences that you are all thinking about in your head right now, hopefully from your own past. And then the idea is to try to remember how aspects that I described today relate to you and other training participants in the room during that experience. And I'd love to check in with you about all of that at the end of the presentation. Hopefully we'll move quickly through it so we can have a larger discussion, but keep those things in mind as we go forward here. All right, so next slide, please. Right, wonderful. Okay, so what in the world am I talking about? So these are them. These are the 5 factors of sustained capacity that came out of my dissertation research, and we will be going through them in great detail today. But these are the basic principles that underlie all of my research on training, which is something that the psychological literature likes to call intrinsic motivation. I call it 5 factors of sustained capacity building. And intrinsic motivation is the basic principle. And this is how I explain intrinsic motivation to many of the environmental professionals that I speak to about this topic. So the way I explain it is that managers and scientists and practitioners of conservation have attempted to encourage human behavior towards conservation goals for quite some time, right? Decades. And usually they use what many call the traditional carrot or stick method. If you've heard of the carrot or stick method, it's either offering individuals an external incentive, like either money or social approval, which I consider to be carrot, or that's the carrot, right? Or implementing regulation to deter some type of action, so that would be the stick. And while these tactics may work and usually do to inspire one-time behaviors, they often do, like attending one training or applying a new skill a few times. Some of the more impactful environmental solutions that you can think of do require an individual to engage in more than one action over time, like continuing to apply a new skill to daily life for professional work. And as a human, I'm sure you all know that applying new skills, or even trying to make tiny tweaks in common behaviors in your own life, can be very difficult, even if it is for the purpose that you really value. There are all sorts of roadblocks and setbacks that will inevitably come up during the process of changing that behavior or continuing to apply that new skill of any kind. So unfortunately, for decades, psychological research has shown that the carrot or the stick tactics will most predictably fail to inspire the kind of steadfast action that is needed to push through these barriers that we're talking about and move on with action plans and conservation. So instead, the carrot or the stick methods that are more traditional, these strategies have often been found to lead individuals to lose steam in their progress over time, or interestingly enough, revolt completely unexpectedly against the whole process or the whole training. And so some of you may have experienced that in your own practice. So the good news is, of course, that psychological science can also tell us with intrinsic motivation that these are the 5 factors that I call 5 factors of success. And these are the 5 factors that pull us into action, largely regardless of external reward or punishment. And as I mentioned before, I have found the 5 components of this type of intrinsic motivation universally predict long-term behavior after trainings across North American and East African populations. So it's cross-cultural, which is super cool for any psychologist to find. So that's what we're going to talk about today in the next few slides. So I think next slide is telling us about the very first concept that we're going to talk about, and it's called meaningful ownership. Right, so meaningful ownership means, and you want to go back one. Don't want to have that up yet. Thank you. So meaningful ownership means that individuals are inspired to continue action over time if they feel that the skill that they have learned is personally or professionally meaningful to them. So my research found that this type of ownership is increased most dramatically in those folks who were specifically prompted to think about how a topic directly applied to their personal or professional experience before the training started. So there are many ways to do this. Trainers, you've done this in many different ways, I'm sure. One of the ways is to include what I did just a couple of slides ago, asking you to think about your personal experience with trainings before we started the main content of our presentation today. However, if I had more access to information about you all before, it would have behooved me to really tap into that information and start our presentation making sure that the participants, you all, really were starting where we all have a commonality, right? So that's how you can do it if you're doing presentations or trainings in the future. And so the reason I say that is because my research most significant showed that this meaningful ownership component most significantly increased in participants who said a lot of the first learning about who their audience, like the trainers did a lot of learning first about who their audience was, what was important to them before the designing or facilitating an event that brought those aspects to the center of conversation. So when this doesn't happen, the participants often leave a training feeling like they understood the concept, right? But they are not really sure why that topic matters to them or how it applies to personal or professional life. And so that is one thing that we need to consider when we're doing any kind of training. I also want to pause here and just say, since this research, I have started working with communities in the United States who are living at or below the poverty line. And I'm working with conservation organizations that are also physically located in those areas that want to engage those historically disenfranchised populations. And so they use some of the same principles while doing this. And so the question always becomes, if I'm not just doing a training, I'm not just doing, just one training one-off, I'm doing a larger intervention where I want to include the individuals so that over time, I don't have to be there anymore, right? And so the question became, how do we do that? And so now, Beth, you can pull up that diagram that I just am talking about. Uh-oh, there it is. Great. Okay, so here's the thing. Throughout our presentation today, I'm going to be pulling from the work that I'm currently doing with those urban populations in the United States, which may or may not be similar to experiences that you all have had. However, the concepts, the factors that we're going to go through, as I mentioned before, are universal. And so some experiences may be similar. So right now, like if you're not doing just a training, you want to get people involved. There's a 4-phase approach that has been created here. It was based on a lot of models that had been traditionally used to engage the community in the co-design of the programming. So basically what we're saying is people will continue to engage in conservation over time if they had a significant role in developing that project or program or whatever it is, right? They will continue to do it over time if they have some hand in actually developing it with you. So you're not developing programs for them, you're developing it with you. And I know Beth does this with the network and her work now. And it's something that's catching on a lot more in the United States. And so the first phase is to identify and analyze who your stakeholders are. The second phase is to identify assets that exist in the communities already. The third phase is strategic planning. And the fourth phase here is pilot testing. And if you want to learn more about all of that, you're more than welcome to either connect with me afterwards. There's going to be a reference down at the bottom that we'll talk about if you want to reference it in your own work as we talk about this. But please do connect with me afterwards and I can go into much more detail about that process. However, when you start with identifying the assets that already exist in the community that you're attempting to build the capacity of, that right there, that is when you get to most effectively figure out what is personally or professionally meaningful to that community. So it helps you build and foster this type of, this aspect of durable capacity. Okay, so I'm going to pause there for a second and ask if there are any questions about that one before we move on to our next piece. Okay. Okay. So if there are no questions, then we can just move on to the next piece here. Okay, so the next piece is effective autonomy. And essentially, the idea is to foster the feeling of, I did this, I got this, I can do this by myself, right? And so effective autonomy means that each individual that we are hoping to inspire into long-term action needs to feel like they have gained knowledge or are engaging in a process that leads to solutions that work regardless of outside influence for guidance. So essentially the feeling here is, I did it, I got this. And it's very close to self-efficacy, if you've ever heard of that concept, but a little bit more autonomy in there, that you don't need an expert over your shoulder telling you what to do. And in my research, my dissertation research, I found that event facilitators who most significantly increased participants' effective autonomy did so by encouraging those participants to lead discussion and asking those participants for feedback while the event was still in progress. So that's the most important piece. The way that when I teach anything, I usually, if I'm in person or over Zoom, I will ask the students every class period or after every session has concluded to think of and anonymously write down for me one thing that they really enjoyed about the class or training, one thing that they wish was better. And I've heard this activity called positive change, or essentially let me tell you kind of really quickly what works and what doesn't with a room full of educators. So here's the deal. I did this at Antioch when I was teaching there, and I will tell you, you do not know yourself or how well you are doing in your job until you have a room full of graduate students who are studying education, and then they get to tell you anonymously how you're doing as an educator. Like it is intense, and it is also helpful. So we frame it right around what we're doing in the moment. And it really helps us keep a pulse on the changing needs throughout the course. So this kind of customizable content, as I'm sure you all can imagine, is often difficult, right, for trainers to offer in traditional training context. So unfortunately, without it though, the students often leave the training with many unresolved questions about how to apply the content for their real work, like to their real work, and therefore they find themselves in need of further guidance after the training. And you may have run into this, I know how I have, which is why you want to do things differently, right? You want to focus on this. And so what I want to say about this is that, as I mentioned, one of the ways to do this is to keep a tally of how things are going while you're doing it, implement the changes while it's happening. A lot of people do take an evaluation after the training is done. But I'm telling you right now, that does nothing for the participants. It helps you create better trainings in the futures. But for the participants that you have in front of you, it is much more helpful to develop effective autonomy if you are iteratively or continuously collecting that information throughout the training, and you are pivoting the training to make sure that it is in line with what is being asked for by your positive change, right? Your little evaluation after at the end of each session. So that's how you do it in a training. I have found, working with zoos across the United States recently, that one of the best ways to do this in a community is to really have open dialogue with the community. And a lot of people ask, how the heck do you go about doing that? You can do focus groups, you can do listening sessions, you can do one-on-one conversations. But regardless of how many of those you do, you're always going to leave out somebody who can't make it to that, interview or to that focus group or to that listening session. And the question is, how do we get the input to help us guide our project if nobody shows up to give us that input? And the answer I have found in working with historically disenfranchised populations in the United States is that you go to them. So what you see in front of you is pictures of a community-wide survey that I was helping to direct at the St. Louis Zoo when I worked there. I mentioned these folks that you see in front of you were full-time staff that we had hired that were born and raised in the area that we were working. And so they knew exactly where to go, right? Like if people couldn't come to our focus groups or our interviews to tell us what they were feeling, we went to them. And so we went to public events, community events. We also went to, different locations, bus stops, things like this, but went to events basically where they were already going to be. We set up shop outside of local stores. And ask people to take a survey that would tell us what they think about how we're doing what we're doing. That's essentially how we were helping. We were helping to create effective autonomy in the projects that I'm currently working on. That's how we do it. So this will be helpful for anybody who's trying to build that capacity, not just in a training, but also in a larger community. All right. So next slide, please. So I want to just mention before we get too far into community demand, that the first two, meaningful ownership and effective autonomy, right? Many of the seasoned trainers out there in my audience today may already be familiar with these two parts, right? Largely either from your own education or trial and error experience about what works and what doesn't. However, the next three that we're going to talk about really are three components of the 5 factors that I have actually found to be often overlooked by even the most experienced training professionals. So on this slide, what I consider to be the most overlooked piece is this thing that I'm calling community demand. And the important thing to remember here is that our personal belief as conservation professionals about what an individual or community needs to learn or to do does not necessarily equate or equal what that individual or group believes that they want or what they need. Right? So therefore, to inspire this longer term action, it is absolutely essential that the individual or the community itself has explicitly asked for the training to occur. So many trainers that I work with often find it difficult to understand why a person would voluntarily come to a training at all or attend an educational event or a discussion. That did not think that they actually needed it, right? So for instance, all of you folks out there, takes a lot of good time and energy to make it to the webinar today, right? So why else would you do that? And somehow, if the idea here being that why would you do that if you didn't need or weren't interested in the topic? Well, I mean, I know that I wouldn't come to a training unless I felt that I needed it. But here's the deal, is that when I say a statement like that, and I believe it to be true about everyone that I interact with, there are a lot of assumptions that I am making about my audience's culture, context, personal motives, all of that. So instead, when I use the scientific method, if you will, instead of my assumptions to investigate the type of situation, this type of situation, my research actually found that facilitators that most significantly increase this aspect of participant community demand, right, did so not by assuming, but by explicitly asking those participants about their interests and needs way before even proposing a training event was going to occur. So it was really cool to see that the trainings that increased this component of the 5 factors in events were the trainers that actually had asked the participants ahead of time in a pre-training survey to tell them exactly what topic they wanted to be trained on. So, right, they had a little fill in the blank underneath a couple of different options and a multiple choice topic selection. So people that filled in the blanks, those are the folks who got the most explicit community demand, like actually fostered the most community demand out of the training. So now here's the deal. So I should just pause before I tell you what the deal is and say that of the trainings that I studied, the one that did this was the training that Beth and her team was offering, because it was the training that was written in as something that the participants wanted to learn about way before they even did the training. So so it seems like you all have a great leader if you you talk with Beth about how to do this. But here's the deal. As professionals, I know that it gets difficult. As facilitators, when we need to consider not only our community's needs, right, but our organizational needs and the goals of our funders and whatnot. And this is about the time when I tell my clients and my partners, as I'm doing this research, that the most important lesson about this dimension of motivation is that when creating a training or information, like anything really, intervention of any kind, you only really need to consider the interests and needs of those who you would like to continue to act in a specific way after you leave, right? So those individuals whose continued action over time is absolutely essential to your project. Those are the folks whose interests and needs need to be paramount in your mind when you're deciding about training content. So that is all I have to say right now, at least about this specific dimension. And we'll come back to this if you have questions. But now we can move on to the next. Oh, wait, before we do, I should explain the picture, of course. One way that you can do this if you're not just running a training, if you're actually attempting to get people involved in the development of a program, like the co-design process, one way to do this is to set up community listening sessions with the individuals who already serve the community, right? I mean, if they don't know what they've been, what has been asked for, then a lot of people probably just won't know. Like, these are the service providers that have already done this, right? And so in the community that you're trying to work with. So when I work with communities in the United States, we do actually ask the service providers who already do a great job at serving the people that we want to engage and build their capacity. We ask them to come to something called community listening sessions, which is a method of basically getting their input on what is working and what is not, and specifically what are the demands of the community that they have heard. The idea here is that in the end, we want to have everyone that we are attempting to build their capacity to feel that their community has told them that they want or need me to know or do whatever it is, right? That's the goal with community demand. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so okay, so here's the thing about group efficacy, which is our fourth of 5 factors that we'll talk about today. The idea here is that's important for is that it's important for individuals to feel effective, not only as individuals, but also as a team. So I love this picture. The idea, this is a team that I was a part of when I was working with St. Louis Zoo. And essentially the feeling that we're aiming here for here is, don't worry guys, like I know that the situation is really complex and the application is really difficult, but together we have got this. And we found that when you do this, whether within your own team or with the individuals whose capacity you're attempting to build, you know, it's more likely that you're going to inspire durable application of knowledge or actual continuation of action if you encourage individuals to discuss about and act on the goals together. So for instance, how we do this, you know, you could, if you're doing it at a training, you could offer a platform for, you know, communication before and after the training so that as a group, they feel more cohesive. And this might not be a common practice already. However, the good news is that there are many ways that you can do this. Having groups from the same organization just come to your trainings themselves. And when that's not possible, being intentional about creating new supportive groups amongst the participants while you're there. And I've also found that pretty much every single time that I talk to an audience, and it will likely happen today, about a topic like this, that I consider to be my area of expertise, there's almost always somebody in the crowd who understands the concept in an incredibly essential but different way, or is willing to share their wisdom with the rest of the audience about how the topic applies to a context that is more relevant than the context that I'm sharing it in, or whatever it is. And the idea is that we want to leverage whatever that is, leverage that energy during the training and identify who is willing to share their knowledge with others. And if culturally appropriate, and that's a big one, if it's culturally appropriate, explicitly ask participants to share their contact information with each other for follow-up help, right? So on that note, I know that a lot of you here have been doing capacity building or are interested in doing capacity building, and you're in some way an expert in this type of thing. And I would encourage you all to continue to have these conversations. It sounds like you already do, which is really exciting. Another reason why I love Beth and your work is that you've already set up the ability to learn from each other. And so this is really exciting. That's one way to do it in trainings. In an actual like engagement, community engagement process, how you can build the capacity of your own team, as well as the individuals that you're attempting to build their capacity, is by identifying what those areas of expertise are, right? That idea of let's identify the assets of the community first, and then help them see how they can move together in a way that's going to move towards the concept of conservation, or the mission of conservation, I should say. So that's the idea. You're attempting to create team spirit. I think we've all been in a situation where I feel like I'm effective, but this person over here is not doing their job. And so we want to avoid that feeling. The idea being, if this person isn't doing their job as a group, we are less effective. We want to avoid that altogether. And those are some ways that you can go about doing that. Yeah. So I'll check back in with you all after the presentation about this. And thanks for thinking about that. So on to the slide. All right. So here is self-regulated understanding. And self-regulated understanding is the feeling of I can identify and correct my own mistakes. It means that the individual has to be able to identify and then revise a mistake in the application of the new skill, whatever it is, or in the participation in the event, or participation in a decision-making process, whatever it is. If they make a mistake, they need to be able to identify it. That's the first move, and then be able to correct it by themselves. And if they can do that, then they have something called self-regulated understanding. And that is the level of understanding, along with the other four we just talked about, that is absolutely essential to predict their long-term engagement in the process or their long-term application of the skill. So, right. So in my research, I found that participants' self-regulated understanding increased the most after events that introduced them to a topic at a level that really aligned with their current understanding of the topic, and then gradually built upon that with new information until they were able to correct their own mistakes in discussion or application So more, some circles around education call this instructional scaffolding. Others call it common sense. But the truth is, in real life, it's easy to forget exactly how much legwork this type of thing really requires to create the scaffolding effectively. So in real life, this may look like sending out a pre-training survey, again, to participants to determine where their knowledge base is, and then starting with a presentation of content that begins at that level. So then you can show them how to apply the information by having them watch or assist in a demonstration of the skill or in the new context. Finally, the final move here is to have participants apply that information directly to an application that is meaningful to them, bringing it back to that meaningful ownership piece, right? So they're all together important. What's super important for you all to know is that of the 5 we just talked about, it is not going to be effective to just foster one of them at a time, or just one of them. It is important to foster all 5. And we're going to talk, I think, in a bit about how you can determine whether or not you're doing that. And what I have found is that when you do that, then you can determine which of the 5 you really need to increase more than the others, right? So yeah, so that's that. And I would say in community engagement, the way that you can do this, the community capacity building, if that's what you're trying to do, is build the capacity of not just one individual, but also a group of individuals. Self-regulated understanding continues to happen with continued check-ins over time. So you really do have to monitor what you're doing, and then reflect back to the community what you think you've heard them say, and then have them be able to tell you what it is that you are doing right, doing wrong. And then here's the key component, here is the pin in all of it, is that the next time you meet with them, you have to show them that you listened, and that whatever it is that they gave you as far as feedback goes really has helped to guide the development of the training or development of whatever it is. And so I want to pause there because I know we've only got 10 minutes left in our time, and I want to respect your time. What is the next slide that we have up here? Can't remember. Oh, I think it's how do we know if we're doing this, which is exciting. And so as Beth is trying to switch the slide over to that next step, I will just say that the way that we've done this with urban populations in the United States is by setting up events, very, very large events that do participatory asset mapping. If you're familiar with that concept, it is essentially coming together and saying, this is what we heard you say after all of the interviews and surveys and listening sessions that we've done. This is what we heard you say. This is what we're thinking about doing. Help us by giving us feedback about where those types of programs already exist in your community. And all of a sudden, you have feedback from the community on top of the feedback you've already connected with that will help you continue to build the capacity of that community or group of individuals. So I'm going to take a breath because that was a lot of information, and I want to know if there are any questions. I just want you to know on this slide that there is a way to know whether or not you are doing this, and that includes the psychometric instruments. So the survey that I created my dissertation, these are 5 different items on that survey, and you do it on something called a Likert scale, which is a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 means I completely disagree with this statement, and 5 means I completely agree with this statement. And you set it up by putting these items on your survey and asking your participants to tell you on a scale of 1 to 5, how much did they agree with these statements. The hope is that if you are doing everything perfectly, which seldom happens, you will be getting 5 on all 5 from everybody, which does not happen. I will just let you know. So instead of using this to know if we're doing it well, what it really helps us do is guide the development of our capacity building programs. Because if you find out that you're killing it on meaningful ownership and effective autonomy, but nobody is feeling community demand, nobody is feeling group efficacy, self-regulated understanding is a little iffy, all of a sudden you have a game plan for how to change your next steps in your program. So I'm going to pause. I know we only have a few minutes left. The next slide, I think, just tells you about how you can. Oh, well, actually, it thanks to you, Beth. So I want to thank everyone for being here. And I also want to thank Dr. Beth Kaplan and the professionals at RNCEAR, TBA, HWCC for their help in the development of this research. It was absolutely essential that we had that piece of it to get to where we are today and to this presentation. So thank you very much, Beth. Thank you to the group of individuals who are also involved with those organizations. And if you want to learn more, that's my contact information. You can also visit my website. And then the last slide there, Beth, is just if anybody wants references. I have references there for you. Yeah, there you are. All right. So.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kayla. That was very, very interesting, and your enthusiasm for this research really comes through. So let's see, I wasn't able to see the chat or anything. Okay, here. So I want to welcome people to either just go ahead and unmute and ask a question. You can raise your hand or you can put it into the chat if you feel more comfortable with that. Oh, Deborah, go ahead, Deborah. Welcome.
Yes, thank you so much, Kyra, for the presentation. I really enjoyed your presentation, but I joined a little bit late, so I'm sorry if I'm going to ask something that you talked about. So I want to ask you, what do you recommend to do if you are starting a training of a capacity building and you can notice that people are not in the mood at all? So what do you do to get them back in the mood? Or what do you do to prevent that people will not be like out of their minds into the training? It's, I mean, in the middle of the training. That is my question. Thank you.
Sorry, forgot my mute button again. Thank you so much, Deborah. So could you just give me a little bit of an example of what you're talking about? Like, has there been a training? Were you thinking of a training that you had been in that people just lost it? Like, what do you mean by that?
For example, you can set a training and now you see that people keep going out. You can see that they're not interested. Or
turning their camera off. Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you do?
Yeah. Woo! Okay, so there's a million different answers to that question, but if we are focusing on how to use the 5 factors to correct the situation, I would say first and foremost, you need to back up to how you got to where you are. Okay, you need to ask yourself if the topic that you're talking about, where did it come from? Okay, you will go into a lot of situations going, I know exactly what these folks need to be able to do the thing that we're asking to build their capacity to do,
so
right?
kind.
And that
Thank
is
you.
probably true. However, the reality is if they haven't asked for it explicitly, the pieces that keep them involved in the moment, as well as later on, will largely not be there. Unless for some miracle, you have chosen the exact thing that they are thinking without asking them first what they are thinking. So one move is to back up a step and instead of changing it in the moment, change it before you even start the thing by making sure that you are only doing trainings based on what they have told you they want to learn, what they think is necessary to know, right? So you give them the idea of where you want them to go. We really want you to be proficient in field whatever it is, techniques of doing, conservation. What part of this do you need to know more of? And then you have them actually tell you write it down, not necessarily here are your choices, but really having an option for them to write it in. And so that's one way to do it before you get in the training. However, I have come across the situation where I'm in the middle of a 3-day training, and day 1, hour 2, I'm finding that people are trying to leave the room. And so the question is, what the heck do I do in the moment? Which is a great question. And I have found that it is and you will have to decide if this is culturally appropriate for the situation that you're talking about. But in my experience, one of the better ways to go about getting people back on track is to directly acknowledge what's happening. Not in a threatening way, not in any kind of way, but just to say, I'm noticing that people are getting a little restless, and I'm wondering if we need to take a break and then come back. I'm also wondering if we can get some feedback at the end of today or in an hour from now about what is going well about this training and what could be improved. And like I said, you do that during the training. In the 3-day training, I did it hour 3 of the first day and was able to turn the ship. Only because they were telling me, Kayla, you're talking about interview methods, and we already know how to do that. So useless information to me. Can you please talk more about this method or this method? And then we were able to completely recreate the training. It's tough, but if you can think on your feet, if you can do it like that and pivot, that's one way to get them back engaged. That's a great question.
Thank you for that question, Deborah.
Thank
Did that
you.
answer your question?
Yeah, sure. I just like the way that getting the feedback from them to see what was not going well, what should be done. So that's great. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, other questions or comments? Feel free to unmute, put it into the chat. I know we're at 4 o'clock. We can take another question or so. Anybody? Well, I don't see other questions coming, but I was just wondering, Kayla, if you I know you've been working on the publications of this work, but do you have other plans for, in a very practical way, like Deborah's question is so practical and applied, like how to get the information you found, these 5 factors, to a very practical approach to, I don't know, a trainer's guide sounds so boring, but something like that, because it is so critically important to, I think, especially like donors understanding what works in conservation work.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Beth. And you and I have been working, and I'm just going to put in the chat for anybody who missed it on the last slide. How do I do this to everyone? The different resources that are currently available that I've been working on, that Beth and I have been working on. So the 5 factors, you can look at my dissertation if that's what you want to do. Like, sure, go for it. If you also just visit my website, you'll have the 5 factors talked about there. In there, I call it the internal carrot, but it's the same thing. And it's a 13-minute video. So you can go to kaylacranston.com and see about it there. I've also written about it in an article that's being published in Zoo Biology in 2022, I believe, called The 5 Psychological Principles of Co-Designing Conservation with, not for, communities. And that is specifically applying all of this to the zoo world. So Beth, your point is well taken. I have found that talking about it at this level is great for a dissertation. However, if you want people to use it, you really have to talk about it, how it applies directly to their experience. And so for the zoo and aquarium world, which I'm currently working with, and other organizations, conservation organizations like World Wildlife Fund, Zoological Society of London, like all of those types of organizations, national or international, I have found that if you just apply it directly to something that they know they need to do, it's helpful. So I've put it together in an article that's coming out there. And then, of course, Beth and I just submitted an article called Defining Sustained Motivation and Capacity Building for Conservation to Conservation Biology. I'll let you know how that goes. But again, if you want to look at a co-design example of this, there's a website there that I've just put in the chat as well that will take you to another webinar that talks about this. But as far as written guides go, Beth, we are doing that at each of the sites. So I currently have 4 sites who are attempting to apply these principles to the engagement and building of capacity with the communities that directly surround their site. And each site is going to create a manual for how they can do it in the future, how other organizations that are in that community can do it in the future. And so I'm doing it site by site, however. You know, it's definitely something to consider whether or not it makes sense to do this in a larger guidebook kind of way.
Yeah, well, thank you. I saw there's a comment that, you know, people may have more questions after they look at some of the links you shared. And so I was wondering, did you, let's see, I was scrolling back up. Do you want to share like your email in case any of the participants here want to contact you?
Absolutely. So just put it in the chat. If anybody's interested and you want to contact me, email me at kcranston@antioch.edu. And I look forward to it. I'm excited about it. We're really looking to expand at the Conservation Psychology Institute. So if anybody is interested in working with us on the application of this in new settings, let's talk about it.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well,
thank you, Beth.
It's yeah, thank you. It's a little bit after 4 o'clock, and again, we try to respect the time. So I know people are busy. We're really grateful to those of you that attended. And as Kayla said, feel free to contact her. Before we leave, I do want to encourage any of you that have a topic you'd like